Great swing, Neil. So now that you've learned how to capture the data, let's take a look at what this all means. So in this case, we've used shift to capture the COP chart and velocity chart information. The COP chart represents the pressure created by gravity in the X and Y axis. These are all the vertical forces created by gravity. In the right-hand side, we break it up into two components, the lateral and the heel-to-toe pressure. The heel-to-toe is represented by the orangey gold line, and the white line is the lateral. Transverse and sagittal forces. So on the left, let's take a look at what we're seeing here. So we can move the scrubber bar to the address position, and you're going to see in this case Neil set up with 52% more pressure on his lead side and 48% on his trail, and this represents his left toe, left heel, right toe, right heel. So it very clearly breaks up how the pressure moves. This is called a linear trace. It's actually an excellent trace. So when the white dot moves to the trail side, and we define transition when this number on the right here, the COP number, flips over to a positive. So you're going to see it very soon, very quickly, start moving to a, it'll flip to a positive as I move the scrubber bar to the right. So right about there is transition. And this is when the number again changes to a positive. So at transition, Neil has got 86% of his pressure on his trail side, 52% on his trail heel. This is what we call a counterbalance technique. This is an excellent trace, actually. It's what we see on the tour. And what I like about this trace, just for your own reference, is that white dot does not go inside to his foot. It actually stays just inside of his right foot. An excellent situation to see and learn from. So now transition, Neil has got 86% of his pressure on the trail side. There's a lot of tour data that collaborates this. You're going to see about 70 to 80% of the pressure on your trail side at transition. At impact, and in this case, we use sound to determine impact, and we'll go right to it. Neil has got approximately 82% of his pressure on his lead side. But you'll see a dramatic move here to his heel, which you cannot see just by using video alone. So let's go back to the beginning here. So what is the velocity chart? On the right here, the velocity chart is really the COP chart broken up into two components. The white line represents the lateral motion. The heel to toe is represented by the orange line. The white line, the scientific term for this is called transverse forces. The gold line, orange line, is really called a sagittal force. But who cares about that? It's heel, toe, or lateral in my terms. Okay, so now let's go right to the beginning. Peak velocity. What is peak velocity? Peak velocity is the fastest motion in a lateral direction. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to move in the velocity chart, and we mark it off for you every time. Right here, 326 centimeters per second. So I'm going to move the scrubber bar until the two lines converge, and right there is peak velocity. Now what you're going to see, and this is important, this matches up. Peak velocity here matches up with the current velocity in the velocity chart. In the very next frame, this is going to slow down. And I'm going to grab the scrubber bar and move it to the right. And you're going to see slowing down. So when you're slowing down laterally, what happens to the rotational forces? The rotational forces start to increase. So peak velocity is the exact point in time when the kinematic sequence begins to occur. So after the lateral motion slows down, rotational forces kick in, and ultimately at impact, you're going to see centrifugal force of the hands turning the club over at impact. But what's interesting here is what you can't see in video is when this white line is going below the baseline, and the baseline is this kind of very lightly colored like a crosshairs. 0 represents impact. So when that white line is above the baseline, it's moving towards his left side if you're a right-handed golfer. And then when it's going downward, you're slowing down. But when it goes below the baseline, this white line means that he's actually going backwards at impact. For a driver, this is how you create distance. You see this a lot in hockey, where they use their lead foot as a brake, and then they hit slightly behind the ice, behind the puck, so they can generate some pressure onto the shaft, and then it creates a more whip. What a lot of power drivers, what they do is they go backwards just prior to impact, and then they'll move forward just at and around impact. But in this case, you can see in the white line here, this is a great trace to examine. The white line is below the baseline, which means that Neil is moving backwards just prior to impact. And watch this number right up here. He's starting to move backwards right here. He's minus, and then he moves forward, it's going to flip to a positive, and then impact. So that's how you read the velocity chart. Now, peak velocity, again, is how fast you're moving in a lateral direction at the fastest moment. And we mark it off, and I'm going to go back to where we marked it off just by grabbing the scrubber bar right there. So you can see that's peak velocity. In the very next frame, as I mentioned again, just to repeat this, in the very next frame, you're slowing down. Watch this number up here, because that's the real live time number. You're slowing down. So as Neil slowed down, his rotational forces now begin. After the rotational forces cease, you have your centrifugal force. After the velocity chart is analyzed, what we also want to take a look at is the release factor. The release factor is the time from peak velocity to impact. And why do we want to know that? That's because when you're stopping your motion in a lateral direction, now your rotational forces are coming into play. So we simply time it from the peak velocity to impact, and in this case, it was 328.1 milliseconds. And we want to know this because this is the load-unload profile of a golfer's shaft. I won't get too much into detail here. You'll see that at some of our seminars. But this is the beginning of using pressure to understand how to fit shafts correctly. I hope you enjoyed that brief explanation of the COP chart and the velocity chart. Terry Hashimoto, BodiTrak.